Zuberi's life was a story of resilience, ambition, and relentless perseverance. Born in Kenya to a family with little means, he grew up understanding the harsh realities of poverty and limited opportunity. His parents, despite their struggles, instilled in him the value of hard work and education, always emphasizing that knowledge was the one thing no one could take away from him. From a young age, Zuberi dreamed of making a difference, not only for himself but for his family and community. And through sheer willpower, he did just that. Now in his early 40s, Zuberi had not only risen out of poverty, but had become one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the infrastructure industry. His company, specializing in urban development, had projects across Africa, Europe, and North America. Yet despite his success and multimillion-dollar fortune, there was one battle Zuberi could never escape: the battle against racism. He knew all too well that no matter how wealthy or accomplished he became, the color of his skin would often be the first thing people saw. Physically, Zuberi was an imposing figure. Standing at 6 feet 4 inches, with broad shoulders and a powerful build, his presence commanded attention. His deep brown skin, sharp features, and piercing dark eyes exuded both confidence and dignity. He was always impeccably dressed, favoring tailored suits that highlighted his refined taste, but nothing about his style was overly ostentatious. He preferred classic cuts, subtle colors, items that spoke to his success but never shouted about it. Even his wristwatch, a sleek, platinum piece, seemed chosen more for its quiet elegance than for the brand recognition. Despite his commanding presence, Zuberi was a man of few words. He believed that actions spoke louder than anything he could ever say, and his career had proven that philosophy time and time again. But it wasn't just his business acumen that set him apart. Zuberi had a deep sense of empathy, rooted in the struggles he had witnessed growing up. He never forgot where he came from, and he often used his wealth to support educational and economic initiatives for marginalized communities, particularly those in Africa and the African diaspora. Recently, Zuberi had made a private acquisition of a luxury hotel in New York City. The hotel, an iconic symbol of wealth and prestige, catered to the elite of the elite. However, Zuberi had intentionally kept his identity as the new owner hidden from the hotel staff and the public at large. He wanted to observe how the place was run without the biases that often come with power and influence. But there was something more personal about this visit. Zuberi had lived long enough in the United States to know that, even in a cosmopolitan city like New York, racial prejudice still lingered in many corners of society. He had experienced the subtle slights and microaggressions himself, times when doormen assumed he was a chauffeur, or when shopkeepers followed him around their stores suspiciously, despite the fact that he could easily buy out their entire inventory. This time, Zuberi wanted to see how a place like this, one of the city's most renowned establishments, would treat a black man who wasn't immediately recognized as wealthy or influential. Would they judge him by his appearance, or treat him like every other guest who walked through the door? He needed to know, not just for himself, but as a reminder of the real world outside the bubble of wealth he had created. Zuberi's plan was simple. He would arrive at the hotel as a regular guest, not revealing his identity as the new owner. It would be a test, a way to assess the staff's character and professionalism. Deep down, he hoped they would surprise him, that they would prove to be better than the stereotypes he had encountered throughout his life. But Zuberi also knew that hope wasn't enough to erase the reality of discrimination he had faced over and over again. And so, with quiet anticipation, Zuberi made his way to the hotel, preparing himself mentally for whatever was to come. He wasn't expecting a warm welcome, but he was ready for whatever challenge lay ahead. After all, this was just another battle in the ongoing fight for dignity, respect, and equality, one he had been fighting his whole life. The bright lights of New York City reflected off the polished marble exterior of the hotel as Zuberi stepped out of his private car. The doorman, dressed in a sharply pressed uniform, gave him a fleeting glance before shifting his gaze elsewhere, seemingly uninterested in offering assistance. Zuberi adjusted the lapels of his tailored suit, his eyes briefly scanning the grand entrance. It was an impressive structure, towering over the busy streets, bustling with the energy of the city that never sleeps. To any passerby, Zuberi looked like just another well-dressed man stepping into luxury, but he knew better. As he walked through the revolving doors into the lobby, the atmosphere changed. The air inside was cool, almost sterile, with the scent of expensive candles wafting through the vast space. The grand chandelier overhead sparkled, casting soft light across the marble floors, the kind of place designed to impress even the wealthiest of guests. Every detail was meticulously curated, from the plush velvet seating areas to the intricately designed floral arrangements. Zuberi's eyes scanned the lobby. Couples sat sipping champagne in the bar, businessmen and women hurried through with briefcases, and hotel staff moved with precision, catering to the needs of their affluent guests. But it wasn't long before he felt the familiar weight of eyes on him. The woman behind the reception desk had noticed him approach, and though she wore a practiced smile, there was a hesitation in her eyes, a brief flicker of something Zuberi had seen countless times before. Judgment. He approached the front desk, maintaining his calm demeanor. Behind the counter stood Malik, the hotel's manager, a middle-aged man in an immaculate black suit, who had been overseeing the front desk operations. As Zuberi drew closer, Malik's smile faltered for a moment, replaced by a look that Zuberi recognized all too well: suspicion. "Good evening, sir," Malik said, his voice polite but lacking warmth. "How can I assist you today?" "I'd like to check in," Zuberi replied smoothly, his deep voice carrying the faintest accent of his African heritage. Without even checking the system, Malik's response was immediate and dismissive. "I'm afraid we're fully booked tonight, sir. There are no rooms available." Zuberi raised an eyebrow. He hadn't missed the dismissive tone, nor the fact that Malik hadn't even glanced at the booking system to verify availability. "Fully booked?" he asked, his voice steady but with a hint of incredulity. "Yes," Malik said, his gaze never quite meeting Zuberi's. "Unfortunately, there are no vacancies. Perhaps you could try somewhere else?" Zuberi paused, taking in the moment. His sharp eyes observed the faint smirk forming at the corner of Malik's mouth, the way his eyes briefly flickered over Zuberi's appearance. His dark skin, his African features, his presence that seemed out of place in this polished environment. Zuberi had faced this kind of treatment before. He'd seen it in countless forms. The subtle racism that whispered under polite words, the way people's perceptions shifted as soon as they realized he didn't fit their mold of wealth or success. But tonight, Zuberi wasn't here to react. He was here to observe. "Strange," Zuberi said after a moment, his tone calm but pointed. "I was under the impression this hotel rarely has every room filled." Malik's smile tightened, clearly uncomfortable with the growing tension. "I assure you, sir, there are no rooms available at this time." At that moment, another guest, a middle-aged white man in a casual but expensive suit, approached the desk. Malik immediately shifted his attention, his demeanor transforming into one of genuine warmth. "Welcome, Mr. Daniels. We have your suite ready for you," as requested. Zuberi watched the exchange in silence, his suspicions confirmed. Malik hadn't even bothered to hide his preferential treatment for the other guest, who had just walked in and was immediately offered a room. The double standard was blatant, and for a brief moment, Zuberi felt the familiar sting of anger rise within him. But he didn't let it show. Instead, he stood quietly, his face unreadable, as he waited for Malik to finish checking in Mr. Daniels. As the other guest walked away with his room key, Malik turned back to Zuberi, his expression returning to the same distant professionalism. "As I said, sir, there's nothing available at the moment." Zuberi nodded slowly, letting the moment sink in. He could feel the weight of the unspoken assumptions hanging in the air. Assumptions about who he was, what he could afford, and whether he even belonged in a place like this. "I see," Zuberi finally said, his voice measured. "Well, thank you for your time." He turned and walked away, feeling the eyes of the staff on him as he headed toward the exit. He knew they were watching, wondering who he was and why he'd even bothered trying to stay at a place like this. But Zuberi had no intention of revealing his identity just yet. He had come here for a reason, and tonight had confirmed what he already suspected. As he stepped out into the cool evening air, Zuberi's mind was already working, formulating a plan. This was just the beginning. He had seen enough, and now it was time to make sure that those who judged him without knowing who he was would learn an unforgettable lesson. Zuberi stood outside the hotel, the cool evening air brushing against his face. but the chill he felt came from something much deeper than the night's breeze. As he replayed Malik's dismissive tone and the blatant disregard for him as a guest, Zuberi couldn't help but reflect on how predictable the situation had been. He had walked into the hotel prepared for this kind of encounter, an encounter not unfamiliar to any black man, regardless of his wealth or success, in a world that still too often judged people by the color of their skin before anything else. As he lingered near the entrance, debating whether to stay longer or leave, he heard a sharp voice from behind. "Sir, can I help you with something?" It was Youssef, the hotel's head of security, a large man, muscular with a stern face. Youssef approached with a sense of authority that bordered on aggression. His dark eyes scanned Zuberi up and down, clearly assessing him as a potential problem, not a guest. "No, thank you," Zuberi responded calmly, turning to face Youssef fully. The quiet dignity in Zuberi's demeanor seemed to disarm the man slightly, but not enough to stop the immediate suspicion that was etched on his face. "I noticed you've been standing here for a while," Youssef said, his voice laced with an underlying edge of distrust. "Do you have a reservation, sir? If not, I'm afraid you'll need to move along." Zuberi couldn't help but let out a small sigh, though he kept his composure. He knew what was happening. To Youssef, and likely to many others in that hotel, he was just a black man loitering near the entrance of an establishment where people like him were presumed not to belong. Despite his sharp suit, despite his composed demeanor, he was being reduced to a stereotype. It was something that many black men in America encountered, no matter their background or achievements. "I was just informed by your front desk manager that there are no rooms available," Zuberi said, keeping his tone neutral. Youssef raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "No rooms, huh?" he muttered, glancing over at the entrance as if debating whether to call in reinforcements. "Well, if that's the case, I suggest you find somewhere else to stay. We don't allow lingering around the premises." Zuberi's patience was wearing thin, but he remained composed. "I see. Is it standard protocol to ask all guests to leave the premises so quickly?" Youssef crossed his arms, his posture becoming more aggressive. "Look, buddy, I don't know what your deal is, but I'm not going to argue with you. This is a high-end establishment, and we have rules. If you don't have business here, I suggest you move along." The tension in the air was palpable. Zuberi, always calm under pressure, understood that this wasn't just about hotel policy. It was about prejudice. Prejudice that told people like Malik and Youssef that Zuberi didn't belong, that his presence was somehow suspicious, even threatening. "Interesting," Zuberi said quietly. He had experienced this kind of treatment before, but it never became easier to accept. No amount of wealth, success, or personal achievement seemed to insulate him from these moments when society's deep-seated biases reared their ugly heads. Youssef, sensing Zuberi wasn't going to leave easily, took a step forward, his voice growing firmer. "Look, I'm not going to ask you again. You can either leave, or I'll have to escort you off the property." Zuberi, still calm but now clearly frustrated, met Youssef's gaze. "You don't even know who I am, do you?" Youssef smirked, shaking his head slightly. "I know enough." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Zuberi. Here he was, the owner of this very hotel, being treated as a trespasser, someone not worthy of respect or consideration, and all because the staff couldn't see beyond their assumptions about what success, wealth, or belonging looked like. The lesson he had come here to teach was unfolding before his eyes, and the very people who were meant to represent the hotel were failing miserably. But Zuberi wasn't ready to reveal the truth just yet. There was a bigger picture in play, a lesson that had to be learned not just by Youssef or Malik, but by everyone who judged people based on preconceived notions. For now, he would let the moment pass. "I'll leave," Zuberi finally said, nodding slightly. "But rest assured, I'll be back." Youssef's eyes narrowed as Zuberi turned and walked away, his figure silhouetted against the bright city lights. As Zuberi disappeared down the street, Youssef shook his head, muttering to himself, "Some people just don't know their place." Zuberi heard those words, even though they weren't meant for his ears. And as he walked away from the hotel that night, he knew that the next time he stepped foot inside, things would be very different. The power he held, the power they had so carelessly dismissed, was about to come crashing down on them in a way they couldn't possibly imagine. As Zuberi walked away from the hotel, his steps slow and deliberate, his mind churned with a mix of emotions. Outwardly, he maintained his calm composure, but internally, a quiet storm raged. This was not a new experience for him. Being dismissed, being seen as less than, regardless of his status or accomplishments. But this time, there was a deeper irony at play. They had no idea who he was. They had no clue that the man they had just disrespected and escorted out was the very owner of the building they worked in. He stopped at the corner of the street, looking back at the tall, imposing structure of the hotel, its gleaming lights, the revolving door constantly spinning with the arrival of new guests, the immaculate lobby beyond. Everything looked perfect on the surface. But Zuberi knew that beneath that polished exterior lay the same systemic issues that plagued so many parts of society. Prejudice didn't disappear in fancy clothes or expensive buildings. It simply became more insidious, masked behind polite words and practiced smiles, just as Malik had done at the front desk. He leaned against a nearby lamppost, his hands slipping into the pockets of his coat. His thoughts shifted to his own journey, how far he had come from the small village in Kenya where he had been born, to now being the owner of multiple properties and businesses around the world. And yet, here he was, once again reduced to nothing more than a skin color in the eyes of people who refused to see beyond that. In that moment of reflection, Zuberi could have easily revealed the truth. He could have turned back, walked into the lobby, and demanded to speak with Malik and Youssef. He could have announced, with justified authority, that he was the owner of the very hotel they had refused him a room in, and watch as their faces transformed from smugness to horror. But Zuberi wasn't interested in a scene. He didn't need immediate gratification or revenge. His style had always been one of quiet power. Zuberi believed that true authority wasn't something you flaunted. It was something you carried within you. And more than that, he knew that the most profound lessons came from experience, not confrontation. If he walked in now, revealing his identity, they would learn nothing. It would just be another moment where someone powerful flexed their status, and they would likely adjust their behavior only to protect themselves from losing their jobs. But Zuberi wanted them to understand on a deeper level, the kind of understanding that comes from reflecting on your own failures and biases. Zuberi smiled to himself, a small, knowing smile. He would return, but not today. When he did, it would be on his terms, with a plan that would leave no doubt in anyone's mind about the importance of treating every person with respect, regardless of appearance or preconceived notions. A taxi passed by, and Zuberi flagged it down, slipping into the back seat as the driver asked, "Where to?" Zuberi gave him an address, leaning back against the seat, still lost in his thoughts. The city lights flashed by as the car sped through the streets of New York. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from Amina, his trusted attorney and one of the few people who knew about his secret purchase of the hotel. "How did it go?" she texted, knowing full well the kind of resistance he might have encountered. Zuberi typed back quickly, his fingers moving with ease across the screen. "As expected," he replied simply. Amina responded almost immediately, "Do you want me to step in?" "No, not yet," Zuberi replied. "There's a lesson to be learned first. I'll handle it in my own time." Amina knew Zuberi well enough not to press further. She had seen him navigate countless situations like this, always choosing strategy over emotion, patience over rashness. Zuberi had a plan, and she trusted him to see it through. As the taxi pulled up to his penthouse in Manhattan, Zuberi stepped out and gazed up at the city skyline. It was a breathtaking view, one that most people would envy, but tonight it felt distant to him. His thoughts were still at the hotel, with Malik, with Youssef, and with all the others who had so quickly judged him. He made his way inside, the doorman greeting him warmly, "Good evening, Mr. Zuberi," with the kind of deference that his wealth usually commanded. But Zuberi knew better than anyone that respect earned through status was fragile. True respect, the kind that mattered, was rooted in seeing people for who they truly were, not what they appeared to be on the surface. Once inside, he sat in his living room, the vast space feeling oddly quiet. The city hummed outside, but Zuberi's mind was already on the next steps. He would return to the hotel soon, and when he did, it wouldn't be as a guest. He would walk through those doors as the owner, alongside Amina, and watch as the truth unfolded in front of those who had judged him without knowing. But for now, he would wait. Sometimes, the most powerful moves are made in silence. The next morning, the hotel lobby was as pristine as ever, bustling with guests checking in, staff bustling about in their well-coordinated routines, and the soft clink of glasses in the bar where business meetings often overlapped with casual conversations. Everything seemed normal, except for a sense of unease that lingered with Zuberi after the previous night's encounter. Zuberi had spent the night reflecting on what had happened, and the more he thought about it, the more resolute he became. He wasn't just going to let it slide. His goal had always been bigger than simply proving a point. He wanted to change the culture of how people like him were treated, not just at this hotel but across his entire business empire. He knew the importance of setting an example, and this was the perfect opportunity to do just that. But first, Zuberi needed to see how things played out today. So, he decided to return to the hotel, once again blending in as a regular guest, and see if anything had changed. When Zuberi walked into the lobby that morning, it felt like stepping back into the same tense environment from the night before. Malik was at the front desk, chatting with a group of guests, while Youssef, the head of security, stood a short distance away, his eyes constantly scanning the room for anything out of place. Zuberi could tell by the way Youssef's gaze briefly landed on him that the security chief remembered him, though there was no immediate sign of recognition on his face. Zuberi approached the front desk calmly. Malik looked up from the group of guests and immediately tensed when he saw him. "Good morning," Zuberi greeted, his voice smooth but direct. Malik forced a polite smile, though it was clear he wasn't pleased to see Zuberi again. "Good morning, sir," Malik replied, his tone tight. "How can I help you?" "I'm still looking for a room," Zuberi said, watching Malik closely. "I was told last night that you were fully booked." Malik hesitated, his eyes darting to the computer screen for a fraction of a second. Zuberi could see the internal conflict playing out on his face. Should he continue the lie, or give in to the possibility that Zuberi might have more power than he let on? "Well, let me check," Malik said, finally breaking the silence, his fingers tapping against the keyboard as he pulled up the reservation system. There was a pause, and then Malik glanced back up. "It seems we do have a room available now." Zuberi simply nodded, not surprised by the sudden availability. But before he could say anything, Youssef appeared beside Malik, his arms crossed, the posture of a man who was ready to assert control. "Is there a problem here?" Youssef asked, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable edge. He looked directly at Zuberi, his eyes narrowing as though he were sizing him up again. "No problem at all," Zuberi responded calmly, turning to face Youssef fully. "Just booking a room." Youssef took a step closer, invading Zuberi's personal space just enough to make his presence felt. "You were here last night, weren't you?" Youssef asked, his voice carrying a weight of suspicion. "We told you we didn't have any rooms available." "That's right," Zuberi said, holding Youssef's gaze. "But it seems now there is a room." The tension between them thickened. Malik watched the interaction nervously, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. Zuberi noticed that a few nearby guests had begun to glance over, sensing the quiet hostility unfolding in front of the front desk. Youssef didn't back down. "Look, we don't need any trouble here," he said in a warning tone. "If you're not satisfied with the service, you can leave now." Zuberi smiled slightly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Trouble," he repeated softly. "I'm not causing any trouble. I'm simply asking for the same treatment you'd give any other guest." Youssef's face hardened. He clearly didn't like being challenged, especially not in front of Malik and other hotel staff. Zuberi could sense that Youssef was used to being the authority in situations like these, using his position to intimidate guests he deemed problematic. "Listen," Youssef said, lowering his voice even further, as though trying to avoid drawing more attention from the guests. "I don't know what your game is, but I suggest you find somewhere else to stay. We don't need people like you hanging around here." There it was, the line Zuberi had been expecting. "People like you." He'd heard it too many times before, the coded language that revealed the underlying prejudice in the most polite, or sometimes not so polite terms. Youssef wasn't trying to hide it anymore. For a moment, Zuberi considered his options. He could leave right then and let Youssef and Malik feel they had won, or he could escalate the situation. But once again, Zuberi reminded himself that this wasn't just about him. It was about something bigger. So, he chose to let the moment pass without revealing his full hand. "I see," Zuberi said, his voice steady. He turned to Malik. "Thank you for your time." And with that, he walked away, leaving Malik and Youssef watching him go. Zuberi felt the heat of Youssef's stare on his back as he exited the hotel, but he didn't care. This was not the time for the final confrontation. That moment would come soon enough. Once outside, Zuberi pulled out his phone and called Amina. "It's time," he said simply when she answered. "Meet me at the hotel tomorrow morning. We'll make the announcement then." Amina's voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable edge of satisfaction in her tone. "I'll have everything ready. Let's show them who's really in charge." Zuberi hung up and walked down the street, his stride confident, his mind clear. Tomorrow, the real lesson would begin. As Zuberi strolled through the bustling streets of New York, his thoughts oscillated between the events of the last 24 hours and the plan for the day ahead. He found himself standing in front of a small coffee shop, a contrast to the sleek, high-end establishments like the hotel he had just left. He entered, ordered a simple black coffee, and sat by the window, watching the stream of people outside. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to reflect on the irony of his situation. A multimillionaire who had just been turned away from his own hotel because of the color of his skin. Sitting there, Zuberi thought back to his childhood in Kenya. His early years were spent in a small rural village where success wasn't measured by money or status, but by survival and family. He remembered the long days working alongside his parents in the fields, the laughter of his siblings, and the strength of his community. Despite the poverty, there was a sense of pride and unity that had shaped his core values: dignity, humility, and perseverance. Even then, Zuberi had known that he was destined for something different. He had been determined to break free from the cycles of poverty that had trapped his family for generations. Education had been his escape, and his mind, sharp and curious, was his weapon. Through scholarships, hard work, and unshakable determination, he had made his way to the United States, where opportunities for success were limitless. Or at least, that's what he had believed. His success as a businessman had been hard-earned. Nothing had come easy for Zuberi, and every achievement was a testament to his relentless drive. But along the way, he had encountered countless reminders that no amount of wealth or accomplishment could shield him from the racism that still pervaded society. From the moment he had set foot in America, he had been judged first by his skin color and only later by his credentials or character. No matter how far he climbed, there were always people waiting to pull him back down with assumptions, stereotypes, and prejudice. But Zuberi was not the type to be deterred by ignorance. He had learned long ago that power came not just from money or influence, but from maintaining control of your emotions, your reactions. The real victory, he knew, wasn't in retaliating against those who underestimated him. It was in changing the system that allowed that kind of behavior to thrive in the first place. And today, he had an opportunity to do just that. Taking a sip of his coffee, Zuberi let his thoughts settle. He considered what it meant to own a property like the hotel. For him, it wasn't just another investment. It was a chance to build something more than just a luxury destination. It was an opportunity to reshape the culture within it, to create a space where people of all backgrounds were treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. And if that meant confronting the deeply rooted biases of people like Malik and Youssef, then so be it. But Zuberi's reflection went beyond just the hotel. He thought about the broader implications of what had happened. In many ways, his experience was emblematic of what countless black men and women faced every day in America. He had been judged not by the content of his character or his accomplishments, but by his appearance. And though his wealth afforded him certain privileges, it didn't exempt him from the casual racism and systemic discrimination that so many others faced on a regular basis. He recalled a conversation he had once had with a mentor many years ago, a fellow African entrepreneur who had faced similar challenges. "The world will always try to put you in a box," his mentor had said. "They'll try to tell you who you are before they even know your name. But your job, Zuberi, is to break out of that box, to show them that you define yourself, not them." That advice had stuck with him, and it was at the forefront of his mind now. He wasn't just going to teach Malik or Yusef a lesson. He was going to make sure that everyone who worked in his hotel understood that prejudice had no place in a world that he controlled. The plan he had crafted with Amina wasn't just about firing a few employees or making an example out of them. It was about setting a standard. When Zuberi returned to that hotel, he would do so not as a vengeful owner, but as a leader determined to create change. Malik and Yusef wouldn't just lose their jobs. They would be confronted with their actions in a way that forced them to reconsider how they treated people, not just Zuberi, but every guest who walked through those doors. The city outside continued to hum with life, but Zuberi felt a quiet sense of resolve. He checked his watch, noting that Amina would be arriving at the hotel soon to finalize the details of their meeting. It was time. He finished his coffee, stood up, and left the shop, the weight of his responsibility sitting on his shoulders, but with a sense of purpose guiding his steps. As he hailed a cab to take him back to the hotel, Zuberi knew that today wasn't just about justice for what had happened to him. It was about something much larger, about changing minds, hearts, and ultimately, systems. And he was more than ready to do it. As Zuberi's taxi approached the hotel once again, a quiet determination settled over him. Today wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making Malik or Yusef squirm, though he knew that moment was inevitable. Today was about showing the world, and especially those who worked under his leadership, that assumptions could no longer define reality. This hotel would serve as a microcosm for the broader changes he wanted to make in all his businesses. No longer could the quiet racism or whispered prejudices be tolerated. Amina was already waiting for him when he arrived. Standing just outside the grand entrance of the hotel, she was a tall, poised woman in her late 30s, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit that reflected her professionalism. Her long, dark hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and she held a sleek leather briefcase by her side. Amina had been Zuberi's attorney and confidant for years. More than that, she was someone who understood the struggles that came with being both black and successful in a world that often seemed stacked against them. As Zuberi stepped out of the cab, Amina greeted him with a nod, her expression serious but calm. "Everything is set," she said quietly, as they began walking toward the entrance together. "Good," Zuberi replied, his voice steady. "Let's make sure they understand exactly who they're dealing with today." The two of them entered the hotel lobby, the familiar opulence surrounding them once again. Malik was at the front desk, chatting with a guest, completely unaware of the storm about to unfold. Yusef stood near the entrance, his eyes scanning the room in his usual vigilant manner. But when his gaze landed on Zuberi, something flickered in his expression. It was a subtle recognition. He remembered their encounter from the day before. Zuberi and Amina walked directly to the front desk, where Malik turned and, for a moment, his smile faltered as he saw Zuberi approach. "Good morning, sir," Malik said, his voice laced with that same underlying tension. "How can I assist you today?" Without responding directly to Malik, Zuberi turned to Amina, who opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder filled with documents. She placed it on the desk in front of Malik. "Mr. Zuberi is here to discuss his recent acquisition," Amina said, her tone firm and businesslike. Malik blinked, clearly confused. "Acquisition?" he repeated, his eyes darting from the documents to Zuberi, the puzzle pieces slowly starting to come together. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand." Zuberi stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. "Yes, Malik," he said quietly but firmly. "I am the new owner of this hotel. The acquisition was finalized weeks ago, but I chose to remain anonymous during the transition. Until now." Malik's face paled as the realization hit him. The same man he had dismissed just a day before, the same man he had refused service to, was now his employer. His lips parted, but no words came out. Zuberi could see the wheels turning in his mind, could see him trying to grasp the enormity of the situation. This can't be," Malik stammered, glancing toward Yusef, who was now walking over, clearly sensing that something significant was happening. "You're the owner?" Zuberi didn't answer the question directly. He didn't need to. His presence, alongside Amina and the documents on the desk, said everything. Instead, he shifted his attention to Yusef, whose face had darkened as he, too, began to understand the gravity of the moment. Mr. Zuberi, Youssef began, his voice still carrying the authoritative edge he'd used the night before, though it was clearly tempered now. If I'd known. Zuberi cut him off, his tone sharp but controlled. That's exactly the point, Youssef. You didn't know, and it shouldn't have mattered. The words hung in the air, a quiet reprimand that carried more weight than any loud confrontation could have. Zuberi watched as Youssef's face hardened, his bravado crumbling under the pressure of his own actions being laid bare. For the past 2 days, Zuberi continued, his voice steady, I've walked into this hotel as a regular guest. I was treated with suspicion, disrespect, and condescension. Not because of who I am, but because of what you assumed about me. And now, you're realizing that your assumptions were wrong. Malik swallowed hard, clearly at a loss for words. I didn't mean any disrespect, sir, he stammered. I didn't realize. You didn't need to realize who I was, Zuberi interrupted. All you needed to do was treat me with the same respect you'd give anyone else. There was a moment of silence, thick with the weight of what had just been said. Youssef stood stiffly beside Malik, his arms crossed defensively, but there was no escaping the fact that they had both been caught in their own prejudice. Amina stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. We'll be conducting a full review of the hotel's staff and operations over the next few weeks. You'll be receiving a notice regarding any necessary changes. Malik nodded weakly, still trying to process what was happening. Youssef, however, spoke up. Look, Mr. Zuberi, I understand that you're upset, but we've been following protocol. We have to make sure the right people are staying in the hotel. It's part of security. Zuberi met Youssef's gaze, his expression unreadable. And what exactly made you think I wasn't the right person? Was it my suit? My manner? Or was it just my skin? Youssef opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The truth was too obvious to deny, and the silence that followed his attempt to explain was answer enough. Zuberi took a step back, looking at the 2 men in front of him. He could see the shame creeping into Malik's face, the frustration in Youssef's posture. But this wasn't just about them. It was about the culture that allowed this kind of treatment to go unchecked, the assumptions that had been made about him because of his appearance, despite his status and wealth. I don't need an apology, Zuberi said finally, his voice calm. What I need is change. And that's what's going to happen here, starting today. With that, Zuberi turned and walked away, Amina by his side, leaving Malik and Youssef standing in stunned silence behind him. The lesson had been delivered. Now it was time for them to live with the consequences of their actions. As they exited the hotel, Amina glanced at Zuberi, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Well, that went about as expected. Zuberi nodded, his expression thoughtful. This is just the beginning, he said quietly. There's still more work to be done. The next day, the atmosphere in the hotel was palpable with tension. News of Zuberi's ownership had already begun to spread among the staff, and whispers filled the hallways. The employees who had seen him enter the hotel as a regular guest now realized they had been interacting with the man who signed their paychecks. For many, this revelation was a shock, a reminder that assumptions based on appearances could be dangerous. Zuberi had requested a meeting with the senior staff and key department heads, including Malik and Youssef, for that afternoon. He wanted this confrontation to be more than just a scolding for bad behavior. It needed to be a transformative moment. It was time to make sure the hotel's leadership understood the deeper issues at play and the changes that were coming. As Zuberi and Amina walked into the hotel's main conference room, it was already filled with a dozen or so managers, all of whom had heard of the recent events but were unsure of what to expect. Malik sat at the head of the table, nervously tapping a pen against his folder, while Youssef stood in the back of the room, arms crossed, looking more defensive than ever. "Good afternoon," Zuberi said as he entered, his presence commanding immediate attention. He didn't need to raise his voice. His quiet authority filled the room. Amina followed, placing a few documents on the table in front of her as she took a seat beside Zuberi. The managers, who had been chatting amongst themselves in hushed tones, immediately fell silent, their eyes trained on Zuberi, trying to gauge his mood. Malik stood up, attempting to regain some control over the situation. "Mr. Zuberi," he started. his voice tense but formal. "First of all, I want to apologize for any misunderstanding or inconvenience caused during your stay. It was never our intention to—" Zuberi raised a hand, cutting him off. "Let me stop you right there, Malik," he said, his tone firm but calm. "This isn't about apologies. This is about addressing a systemic problem. What happened to me wasn't a misunderstanding. It was the result of a mindset that's been allowed to fester in this hotel for far too long." Malik's face flushed, and he sat back down, clearly uncertain of how to proceed. The rest of the room watched Zuberi intently, the tension mounting as everyone waited to see what would come next. Zuberi looked around the table, his gaze settling on each person in turn. "I want to make one thing clear," he continued. "What happened during my visit here wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a larger issue, an issue that goes beyond me and affects how this hotel operates at its core. The fact that I was judged and dismissed based on assumptions about my appearance speaks to a much deeper problem." Youssef, who had remained standing at the back, finally spoke up, his voice gruff. "Look, Mr. Zuberi, with all due respect, security protocols are in place for a reason. We have to assess people quickly to ensure the safety of our guests." Zuberi turned to Youssef, his expression calm but unyielding. "And what was it about me, Youssef, that made you assess me as a threat? Was it the way I dressed? The way I spoke? Or was it something else entirely?" Youssef opened his mouth to respond, but once again, no words came out. He shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing that any justification he could offer would only dig the hole deeper. The weight of his prejudice hung heavy in the room. Zuberi didn't press him for an answer. Instead, he let the silence speak for itself before continuing. "What happened to me isn't unique. It happens to countless people who walk through these doors, guests who don't fit the image of what some of you might expect from someone staying at a place like this. It's an attitude that needs to change." Amina spoke up next, her voice calm but authoritative. "We've done an extensive review of the hotel's operations since Mr. Zuberi's acquisition, and what we've found is concerning. There are gaps in the training of staff, especially when it comes to cultural sensitivity and implicit bias. Those gaps have led to incidents like the one Mr. Zuberi experienced, but they've also created an environment where discrimination can flourish unchecked." The managers around the table exchanged nervous glances. They had expected a stern lecture, perhaps even a few firings, but it was becoming clear that this was about more than just a single incident. Malik, who had been silent for most of the exchange, finally spoke up again, his voice shaking slightly. "Mr. Zuberi, I assure you that we take this seriously. If we need to change our policies, we will. We didn't know. I didn't know." Zuberi nodded, his expression softening slightly. "I believe you, Malik, but that's part of the problem. You didn't know, and you didn't care to know. You didn't even take the time to look beyond your assumptions. And because of that, you made decisions based on prejudice rather than professionalism." He let that sink in before continuing. "From this point forward, things are going to change. Amina and I have put together a plan to overhaul the hotel's training programs. Every employee, from the front desk to security to management, will undergo mandatory training on implicit bias, cultural sensitivity, and customer service. This won't just be a one-time thing. It's going to be an ongoing process to ensure that this hotel becomes a place where every guest is treated with the same respect, no matter who they are or what they look like." Amina slid the documents across the table. "This is the new training program, along with a revised code of conduct for all employees. We'll be implementing these changes immediately." The room was silent, the weight of the changes sinking in. It was clear to everyone present that Zuberi was serious about his vision for the hotel, and that any resistance would be futile. "There's one more thing," Zuberi said, his voice steady. "As of today, Malik, you will no longer be the manager of this hotel." Malik's eyes widened, and he started to speak, but Zuberi held up a hand. "This isn't a punishment," he said. "It's a reflection of the fact that this hotel needs new leadership. Someone who understands the importance of the changes we're making and who can lead by example. You've done good work here, but it's time for a different direction." Malik sat back, defeated, but he nodded slowly, understanding that this decision was final. Zuberi then turned to Youssef. "As for you, Youssef, your role will also be changing. You'll be working directly with our new head of security, undergoing the same training as the rest of the staff. Your experience is valuable, but we need to make sure that experience aligns with the values we're putting in place. Youssef didn't respond, but the tension in his shoulders told Zuberi he understood. This was a second chance, but one with clear expectations. Zuberi stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. This isn't just about fixing what went wrong during my visit, he said. It's about ensuring that this hotel represents the values of respect, equality, and professionalism in everything it does. I expect all of you to be part of that change. With that, he and Amina left the room, leaving behind a group of managers who now understood the gravity of the moment. The confrontation had happened, but more importantly, the shift toward change had begun. The aftermath of the meeting rippled through the hotel like a shockwave. Word spread quickly that Malik had been removed as manager and that Youssef's role was being restructured. For the staff, this was more than just a shift in leadership. It was a clear signal that the culture of the hotel was about to undergo a significant transformation. No longer could they rely on the comfortable patterns of behavior that had gone unchecked for years. There was a new standard in place, one that Zuberi was determined to enforce. That afternoon, Malik sat in his office, his belongings already half-packed into a box. The room, once his domain of authority, now felt cold and unfamiliar. He stared blankly at the framed photographs on his desk, memories of years spent working his way up in the industry. Yet, despite all his accomplishments, it had taken just one incident to bring his tenure here to an end. There was a knock on the door, and Amina stepped in, her demeanor calm but direct. "Malik," she said softly, "I understand this is difficult, but this decision was necessary for the future of the hotel." Malik nodded slowly, though his face showed the strain of trying to hold back his frustration. "I know I messed up," he admitted quietly. "I should have treated him better, treated everyone better. But it wasn't just about him being the owner. I didn't even think about it. I don't know why I acted that way." Amina sighed, her tone more empathetic now. "That's exactly the point, Malik. It's not about knowing who he is. It's about treating every guest with respect, regardless of who they are. Zuberi's ownership is incidental. What matters is the way you allowed your assumptions to dictate your behavior." Malik ran a hand through his hair, the weight of it all settling on him. "And Youssef?" he asked. "What's going to happen to him?" Amina crossed her arms. "He'll be working closely with the new head of security, undergoing the same training as everyone else. He won't be terminated, but his role is changing. Zuberi wants him to understand the full extent of his responsibilities, especially when it comes to how he deals with people." Malik nodded again, but it was clear the reality of his dismissal was still sinking in. "Do you think I'll get another chance?" "Not here, but somewhere else." Amina's expression softened. "That depends on you, Malik. This isn't the end of your career, but it's a wake-up call. You need to reflect on how you can do better, how you can lead in a way that brings people together, not alienates them. If you can learn from this, I'm sure you'll find another opportunity." With that, Amina left Malik to his thoughts, knowing that this was a difficult but necessary consequence of the hotel's new direction. Meanwhile, Youssef was meeting with the hotel's new head of security, a no-nonsense woman named Carmen, whose background in corporate security included extensive training in de-escalation tactics and diversity sensitivity. Carmen wasted no time outlining the new procedures that would be put in place, emphasizing the importance of treating every guest with the same level of professionalism and respect. "Youssef, I'm not here to replace you," Carmen said as they sat in the security office, reviewing the new protocols. "I'm here to make sure we're running a tight ship, but one that doesn't make assumptions about people based on how they look." Youssef, visibly humbled, nodded. "I understand that now. I've been doing this job for a long time, and I got used to thinking I could size people up. I realize now how wrong that was." Carmen leaned forward, her tone firm but not unkind. "We all make mistakes, but the important thing is that we learn from them. This isn't just about following security protocols. It's about understanding the impact of our actions. Every decision we make affects how people experience this hotel. That's the kind of responsibility we have to take seriously." Youssef felt the weight of her words. He had prided himself on being able to control situations, to keep the hotel running smoothly by eliminating any perceived threats. But he hadn't considered the damage he could cause by judging people too quickly, especially when those judgments were clouded by bias. As the days passed, the entire staff underwent the new training sessions. The sessions, led by diversity and inclusion experts, were eye-opening for many. They covered everything from recognizing implicit bias to handling difficult situations with empathy and respect. Staff members were encouraged to share their own experiences and reflect on how they could improve their interactions with guests. During one session, a bellhop named Danny spoke up. "You know, I never really thought about it before, but I can see now how I've treated some guests differently without even realizing it," he admitted. "Like, I would give more attention to guests who looked wealthy or important and kind of ignore the ones who didn't." Others nodded in agreement. For many of the employees, these realizations were difficult but necessary. The training wasn't just about compliance. It was about creating a new culture, one where every person who walked through the hotel's doors felt valued and respected. Zuberi made it a point to stay involved in the process, occasionally dropping in on the sessions and speaking with staff members directly. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but he also knew that it had to start with leadership. In the weeks that followed, the transformation within the hotel was palpable. Guests noticed the shift in attitude from the staff, with many commenting on the increased warmth and professionalism. The atmosphere became one of inclusivity, where every guest felt they were treated as equals, regardless of their background or appearance. Malik, after a difficult period of reflection, eventually found a new position in a smaller hotel chain, taking the lessons he had learned with him. Though he had lost his job at Zuberi's hotel, he had gained something far more important: a deeper understanding of how to lead with empathy and respect. Youssef remained in his role under Carmen's guidance, but he was a changed man. He approached his job with a newfound humility, always taking a moment to check his assumptions before making decisions about guests or staff. He had learned the hard way that power, when misused, could cause harm, but it could also be a force for good if wielded with wisdom and care. For Zuberi, the changes at the hotel were just the beginning. His experience had reminded him of the power he held not just as a businessman but as a leader who could shape the culture of the spaces he controlled. He wasn't interested in punishing people for their mistakes. He wanted to create environments where those mistakes could lead to growth and change. The hotel was now a place Zuberi could be proud of, not just because it was his, but because it had become a symbol of what could happen when people were given the opportunity to learn, to change, and to treat each other with the dignity they all deserved. Weeks had passed since the changes at the hotel, and Zuberi sat in his penthouse overlooking the New York City skyline. The sun was beginning to set, casting golden hues over the buildings, a sight that always made him pause and reflect. Today, however, his thoughts weren't just on the beauty of the city, but on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The hotel was running smoothly now, and the culture shift he had envisioned was taking root. But more importantly, the lessons he had set out to teach had been learned, not through punishment, but through understanding. Zuberi had never been one for grand gestures of revenge. He believed in justice, but justice didn't always mean punishment. It meant accountability and change. Malik had moved on to another role, humbled but stronger for the experience. Youssef remained at the hotel, transformed by the process, now working alongside Carmen to ensure that every guest was treated fairly and with respect. For Zuberi, seeing these individuals grow from their mistakes was the true measure of success. As he thought back to the first night he had walked into the hotel as an anonymous guest, Zuberi felt a sense of satisfaction, but also a reminder of the work that still needed to be done. His experience at the hotel had been just one of many that people of color, especially black men, face every day in places of privilege. His wealth and status had not shielded him from prejudice, and that, more than anything, had motivated him to act. He leaned back in his chair, replaying the moment when Youssef had tried to justify his actions with security protocols, and how Malik had quickly dismissed him without a second thought. It wasn't that they were inherently bad people, Zuberi knew that. It was that they had allowed society's deep-rooted biases to shape their behavior in ways that were harmful. And that was what Zuberi had set out to change, not just within his hotel but in every space he could influence. The work wasn't over. The hotel was just one step. Zuberi knew that if he truly wanted to make a difference, He had to continue to challenge the systems that allowed this kind of behavior to persist. His businesses, his investments, and his influence gave him the power to set new standards, to hold people accountable, and to build environments where dignity and respect were at the core of every interaction. A knock on the door broke his train of thought. Amina stepped in, carrying a stack of papers and her ever-present briefcase. "Thought I'd give you an update," she said, sitting down across from him. "The final reports from the hotel are in, and things are looking good. The training program is working. Guest satisfaction is up, and staff morale is improving. Carmen's made some great strides with Youssef and the rest of the team." Zuberi nodded, listening intently. He valued Amina's insight more than anyone else's. She had been by his side through every step of this process, helping him navigate the complexities of ownership and the even more complex dynamics of race, power, and leadership. "Good to hear," Zuberi replied, his voice calm but reflective. "But this is just the beginning, Amina. You know that, right?" Amina smiled softly, knowing exactly what he meant. "I do. You've never been one to stop at the first success." Zuberi leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "We've started something important here. The hotel, the staff, they're just a small part of the bigger picture. What we've done is create a model, a blueprint for how businesses should operate. It's not just about profits, it's about people, and I want to take that model further." Amina raised an eyebrow. "You're thinking about expanding this approach?" Zuberi nodded. "Not just within this hotel, but across all of our properties. Every hotel, every business I own, needs to operate under the same principles we've established here: respect, equality, and professionalism. Those need to be our core values, not just buzzwords we put on a website." Amina could see the determination in his eyes. Zuberi wasn't just satisfied with a single victory. He was planning for a much larger impact, one that could ripple out far beyond the walls of the hotel. "You know I'm with you on this," she said, "but it's going to take time, and not everyone is going to be as receptive to change as Malik and Youssef were." "I know," Zuberi replied, "but that's what makes this work important. People like Malik and Youssef, they weren't bad people. They were trapped in the same system that teaches all of us to see the world through a distorted lens. If we can help them change, we can help others do the same. This isn't just about individuals, it's about the system itself." Amina leaned back, considering his words. "So, what's the next step?" Zuberi smiled, a glint of ambition in his eyes. "We start with the leadership. The people at the top set the tone for everyone else. I want to meet with the executives across all our properties. We'll implement the same training, the same accountability measures. It won't happen overnight, but we'll get there." Amina nodded in agreement, pulling out her phone to start scheduling meetings. "You know, this could really change the way people do business," she said thoughtfully. "If we pull this off, we could set a new standard for how companies operate, especially in industries where people's perceptions matter so much." "That's the goal," Zuberi said quietly. "If we can make a space where people are seen for who they are, not just what others assume they are, then we're doing something meaningful." This hotel was just the beginning. The two sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of their plans and the scope of their vision settling in. Outside, the city moved on as it always did, unaware of the quiet revolution being planned in the penthouse above. For Zuberi, this wasn't just about changing one hotel. It was about creating a world where every person, regardless of their background, could walk into any space and be treated with the respect they deserved. It was about justice, but not the kind that demanded retribution. It was the kind of justice that sought to heal, to build, and to create something better. As the sun finally set, Zuberi stood up, ready to take the next steps toward a future where his vision of respect, dignity, and fairness wasn't just a dream but a reality. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and watch this next story that's really exciting.